Thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. We're going to be talking about policy, really exciting stuff happening in 2021. First up, we love to thank our members. You are really what makes it possible for us to do the work that we do. We really appreciate you and all that you're giving back to the biking community. And so now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. We've got Noah, our Federal Affairs Manager, as well as Morgan, our State and Local Policy Director, ready to talk about policy. And my name is Lindsay Goff. I'm the Digital Marketing Manager at PeopleForBikes. As far as our agenda, so we're going to run through these 4 things. How do we keep the momentum going around biking? Our Section 301 exclusions update and our trade agenda, our 2021 policy agenda, and then 2021 and beyond, our policy pillars, what happens next. And just a quick note on the format, this will be 30 minutes, so feel free, drop any questions that you're having throughout into the chat or into the Q&A feature at the bottom. And then we're going to take the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So with that, we're going to dive right in and I'll hand it over.
Great, thanks, Lindsay, and welcome everyone who's joining us today. You saw my photo earlier. I'm Morgan Lomley. I'm the Director of State and Local Policy here at PeopleForBikes. And the first thing I wanted to cover, which you saw kind of a preview for on your agenda, was keeping the momentum going. And the way I'll kind of preface this is I see 2020 as a year where bicycle ridership boomed and bicycle sales boomed, and bike supply generally was cut really dramatically in March when we were faced with a pandemic and stay-at-home orders. And little did we know, folks, once they had a little bit more freedom of their schedule and sometimes literally nothing better to do, started bicycling again. And as we the second part of that, as we transition into 2021, we're really trying to understand beyond, sure, you had nothing to do with your free time, but beyond that, what really motivated these new riders to start riding bikes, either again or for the first time? What motivated cities to build infrastructure that was either on a kind of a temporary or permanent basis? And we conducted 2 studies that shed some light on those things. And the reason why we're opening our policy and our trade webinar with that today is I think it really sets the stage for keeping the momentum around bike riding going. How do we define what that momentum means? How do we define what the bike boom means? How do we take this, what I consider to be a mandate from the public to build better places to ride bicycles, to make sure that the supply behind bicycling production ramps up and stays up? How do we frame that within our policy work and our trade agenda and our state and local and federal policy work? So we are proud to announce kind of preliminary results around this, and I'll read these off right here, but add a little bit more color. Essentially, we understand that the pandemic led to this dramatic change in every aspect of people's lives, and people are still generally grappling with life and death situations, sustained solutions for controlling the spread of the virus, and just the opportunity to bicycle. And so what we really wanted to do was define that so that we can frame it to cities and understand how to make products that continue to meet people's needs, new and existing riders. So some of the findings of understanding this new population of riders and the motivations of cities, I'll share right now. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, 10% of American adults engage with cycling in a new way. 10% is a really large number. If our population is, 350 million, that's 35 million people who rode a bike for the first time in more than a year because of this pandemic. And I always shy away from silver linings and really using this as a forcing factor, but that's a large percentage of the American population who are now riding again. And one of the fascinating discoveries was new riders are only slightly different than existing riders. So new riders are more likely to participate in kind of one type of bicycling, but they're more motivated to ride their bike for the same reasons as existing riders: exercise, stress relief, being outside, and they're equally likely to purchase a new bike within the next year. Some other interesting findings here: those who started riding during the pandemic plan to stick with it. And, many new riders turned to cycling because they wanted to get out of their house, wanted a fun way to exercise, wanted to spend time outside. And those people who we polled, the survey was about 2,000 people, plan to continue riding indoors and riding for recreation, especially when the weather gets a little bit better. The last finding I wanted to share here was just framing this for cities. So we saw that in June 2020, city leaders began to prioritize street changes that would support local businesses. And we were worried that a lot of these cities would scale back, temporary bike infrastructure, that as the pandemic hopefully dissipated, they would go back to kind of business as usual. But what we're finding is that the city leaders are hopeful that the popularity of bicycling will help them achieve broader mobility and recreational goals. So there's general consensus that cities can build momentum for proposed projects and programs that will grow cycling in the future, despite an uncertain financial future, despite a lack of preparedness. But this public mandate on behalf of millions of new bike riders in America does motivate cities to build better bike networks faster. So again, we just wanted to frame that research because that's really helped us craft our 2021 trade agenda, our federal policy agenda, and a lot of the work we'll do at state and local governments to both secure funding for bicycling projects and make sure that the conditions to continue the growth of ridership stay the same.
So knowing all of that, and it's super exciting to have those results and use those to inform our policy work, we want to talk a little bit about our trade efforts and Section 301 and all these business-focused issues that are really, really important to the bicycle industry, and is definitely we spent a lot of time on it here at PeopleForBikes, and we're trying to, just constantly make a better business environment for bicycle companies through our policy and legislative work in Washington, D.C. and at the state and local levels, so that small and all bike businesses can continue to thrive. So with Section 301 exclusions, for those are familiar or affected by these tariffs, you know that they are scheduled to expire on December 31st, meaning a significant amount of bicycle products from China will be subject to higher tariffs after the 31st. And starting January 1st, we don't have any indication from trade officials that anything will change besides those tariffs going into effect. As we are doing our darndest here in DC, trying to influence the United States Trade Representative. We are talking to people in Congress constantly, working across coalitions of industry groups that are facing similar challenges to get exclusion extensions and to try to maintain and continue this trend of saving the industry money on exclusions. PeopleForBikes has obtained more than $140 million in exclusions, or saved through exclusions we've obtained. We would have saved that amount of money for the bicycle industry, and we want to continue to grow that so we can support bicycle businesses in a time where there isn't a whole lot of certainty and supply chains are in flux, and we know you're trying to plan for 2021 and beyond. So knowing all of that, we, with some industry leaders, worked on a very official trade agenda sort of report that is now up on our website and we'll share in the notes. It's pretty dense, it's pretty long, but I think it's really exciting. It tells a very detailed story of trade in the bicycle industry in the US. And it includes recommendations to the new administration, the incoming administration, and the new 117th Congress that will be starting in January. And so these 7 recommendations are sort of the areas that we're focusing on in our trade agenda. We have specific policy goals in it that you can find in their report, but they're focusing on how can we create a better trade environment for U.S. bicycle industry to achieve these goals here. And these are the reforms that we're looking for. We're crossing public health needs, trying to increase youth participation, thinking about our global impact as the bicycle industry as we, manufacture abroad and do trade across the entire world. What is the impact that our industry has in those places? And we're looking at climate change too, as how do we leverage bikes in the climate change fight? And we know that they play a really important part in reducing emissions. So how can we use our trade policy in the US to support goals around climate change too? So we obviously work on more than just trade here at People4Bikes at the federal agenda. You may have seen if you've been following our work, and we'll also share this in the feedback emails too, but People4Bikes, in partnership with the Rails to Trails Conservancy, a well-respected national infrastructure-focused advocacy group, we partnered on our federal agenda for active transportation policy. So looking at infrastructure and transportation and equity and planning, and how do we look at all of these realms of policy that changes the way and where we can bike in the US, and leveraging this new energy that we know exists from our studies and research, injecting that into really strong policy goals in 2021. We want to increase funding so we can build out better bike networks. Like I said, we're focusing on climate change because of the opportunities we have to reduce emissions by supporting bicycles and bike infrastructure. We want to make transportation planning more equitable. That's a really important goal in our policy agenda, and what kind of reforms we can make at the federal level to support planning at the local level is a really significant part of this work. And of course, electric bicycles are making their way into everything we do at People4Bikes, at every level of government. We know electric bicycles answer so many people's needs for transportation, for mobility, for recreation, of course, and we want to plug and play with electric bicycles as much as we can in the policy space. The specifics of the agenda that we drafted with Rails to Trails Conservancy, which I'll add, we have shared with President-elect Biden's transition team for transportation. It's been shared widely across the Hill and has been endorsed by a really diverse, large coalition of companies and organizations and interests. But these are specific areas of goals that we have for policy. We want to expand connectivity. We're looking at legislative opportunities in 2021, like a transportation reauthorization bill, and of course, economic stimulus opportunities in response to the pandemic. We are thinking creatively about the structure at the Department of Transportation and think there should be a dedicated office to active transportation. We know road safety is a problem, and to the extent that we can through federal policy, we should be increasing funding to safety measurement and data programs to reduce pedestrian and bicycle deaths and injuries, fatalities and injuries through policy, through funding, and through research. Like I said, equitable planning is a huge priority so that more people can now access bicycle infrastructure and can reap the benefits that we know that strong, connected, protected networks can bring, especially to historically disinvested communities and low-income communities. Again, we're leveraging bike infrastructure to reduce carbon emissions, and including electric bicycles just because of the power we know they have to replace car trips. And thinking about federal lands and access, we want to increase access for electric bicycles in a thoughtful and careful way with land management agencies.
Thanks, Noah. And I'll chat about our state and local policy agenda. So this webinar really helped me kind of condense it into 5 key areas that I hope resonate with you all. And again, this is informed largely by this new momentum around bicycling and the way we're able to frame bike riding and simply riding a bike for transportation as not just a fringe activity and something that's vital to cities, both from an economic lens, from a public health lens, mental wellness lens, and simply just reducing congestion and increasing transportation options. So all that said, there are kind of 5 main pillars of our state and local policy strategy going into 2021. The first is, I'll read this and then add some color, ensure that efforts to provide safe places to ride bikes are supported by elected officials and well funded by the government. To me, this is a messaging exercise. It's a marketing exercise. It's what are the arguments, kind of the political campaign tactics and tools, what are the messages that we can use to frame bike riding and bicycling as, again, more than just a recreational activity. And we do that in a way that then supports the build out of complete bike networks. And so safe places to ride bikes don't just benefit bike riders, they benefit people who use transit, people who drive cars, people who choose to get around a city in another way, which is perfectly legitimate. We just want safer places to ride a bike so that everyone feels safer on the road. And again, this new crop of riders that joins our existing crop of riders can help bolster that argument, but we really want to tell that story to elected officials and governments and then fight for it to be funded appropriately. And that brings us to the next point, just making sure that state transportation budgets and city transportation budgets for active transportation are preserved. Most of the money that goes to building better places to bike in a city doesn't generally come from state governments or isn't generally appropriated or authorized by a state transportation agency. It comes from cities. But there is still funding for active transportation at the state level. And as legislatures convene again in 2021, we want to make sure that any potential cuts to active transportation budgets are genuinely fended off. So we'll do that through a lot of that storytelling and bringing that message that bike riding is vital to both pandemic recovery and just the future of transportation and mobility in cities. And in cities, a lot of the transportation funding comes from ballot measures, sales tax, bonds, and we will work to advance those more proactively as well. And one thing I'll add about that is, unfortunately, we'll probably see budget cuts to all departments at the municipal level, and transportation won't be spared, but to the extent we can, we'll try to preserve and protect active transportation budgets. The third here, help retailers engage with their communities to advocate for broader implementation of safe bicycling networks. This, in other words, means using the voice of bike retailers, bike suppliers, anyone who is in the business of bikes as a critical stakeholder to supporting better bike riding in cities and states. So what that means is, if you're a bike retailer, you employ people, you pay taxes, you contribute to the vitality of our local economies, and you play an active role in advocating for better bike infrastructure. So giving retailers the tools they need to do that is really critical. And we do that through our toolkits and a lot of our kind of trade association duties. Lindsay, I'll ask you to move on. Okay, the fourth and fifth points I wanted to make here in terms of how we're promoting biking at the state and local policy levels. The fourth here is developing infrastructure-based guidance to sustain increased levels of ridership. And what this in my mind is what resource, both helping cities go deep on building out bike network plans that provide connected, comfortable, safe biking opportunities for all in cities, but it's also quick build guides. You know, in March, April, May, we saw cities respond to a massive increase in demand for bike riding with temporary infrastructure, cones, paint, signage. That's all quick build. How do we get safer places to ride a bike in cities overnight, as opposed to contracting, pouring concrete, securing rights of way, things like that? The quick build guides are really critical to future emergency response, but also allow cities to be really nimble to respond to critical sections of infrastructure that are unsafe, but would connect a larger network, or overnight demand from new areas of business or areas of residence for bicycling. So both the long-term going deep on network planning, but also the quick build guides are critical so that cities can remain nimble. And then fifth is just, you know, Noah mentioned this a little bit in our federal policy agenda, but I sound like a broken record, bikes aren't just for bike riders. therefore mobility, vitality, economic resilience across all levels of a city and a state and at the federal government. And so what are the partnerships we can foster with groups that aren't necessarily in the bike space, but would benefit from a growing ridership, or vice versa? What are the climate change arguments we can make to show that bike riding does mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and it helps clean up our air, things like that. So there are lots of different ways we can insert bikes in all levels of policy across all levels of government, and we're thinking about that more than ever.
Morgan's last point there is really great leading into this. Electric bicycles, I mean, in a sense, are taking over. At least they're taking over our work, and that's a great thing. They just offer so much potential for so many people who might just, for any reason. I mean, you don't need a reason, but for any reason, they're fantastic, and they're doing so much to just increase mobility and increase people's transportation options and give people more choice in how they get around, because they give you the ease of an electric bicycle. And so to that end, we are exploring every type of electric bicycle incentive, tax credit, rebate program out there. We're trying to just collect every example that we're finding across the US. In Europe, they've been around much longer. There's a longer history of different types of incentives and tax schemes at the EU level, at national levels, and at city and county levels. And in the US, they're starting to take off across a bunch of different industries and sectors. So while we are at PeopleForBikes collecting, cataloging, and researching existing programs, we're taking that information to work with partners, stakeholders, anyone who will listen to us about e-bikes at this point, about creative ways to provide incentives for people to either purchase or ride on electric bicycles. We've seen some successful examples at electric utility companies offering rebates to their account holders for purchasing an electric bicycle. At the federal level, we are talking to tax lawmakers about a federal tax credit for electric bicycle purchases. We're doing the same thing at the state and local level. We're talking to counties. We are talking to private sector employers about the programs they use to incentivize and provide benefits for their employees commuting to work by bike, by car, however, and figuring out how an electric bicycle can work for them, because we're almost sure it can. And we're just seeing so much excitement from economic development groups, from other utilities, from our nonprofit partners, and from city level folks too. So it's just an exciting time to be working in the space of electric bicycles. There's a million things happening at once, but we think, over time through design and introducing legislation at state and federal levels, we'll see a lot more examples of incentives to get people purchasing and riding electric bicycles more often.
Great, so we are going to wrap it up with our policy pillars and how this differentiates from all the information we shared with you so far today. Is a lot of that was in response to increased tariffs on the industry, or this new positioning and more political appetite for talking about bikes within the context of climate change, or really protecting in the short term state and city active transportation budgets. But we've gone through PeopleForBikes has gone through kind of a strategic planning exercise the last 3 or 4 months to develop what is our 5-year policy framework. How does all this that we just talked about fit within these 5 pillars that we're advancing to make bicycling more accessible for all, more equitable, to use bikes as a tool to fight racism and promote mobility justice, make sure that electric bicycles have a place to ride on public property, and growing the bike industry. So through that strategic planning process, we did go through all the potential work we could do and narrowed it down to 5 main policy pillars. And I'll give you just a quick preview on that before we move over to question and answers. But it's really how do we create a prominent place for bikes in transportation and mobility and recreation at all levels of government. And we feel like we can do that by improving recreational access for bikes, and that is everything from securing funding for new parks and trails, building places to bike that are close to home, improving road cyclist safety, increasing access for kids and veterans and electric bicycle riders and underserved communities, and then promoting recreational-based economic development in rural areas. The second is building safe mobility networks, and this is new funding infrastructure or new funding mechanisms for bike networks, and a lot of that messaging work to create the political will to build better places to ride. The third is fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a lot of this revolves around breaking down those barriers to making public spaces more welcoming. Positioning access to bike networks and transit as integral parts of land use and housing development. Promoting a lot of reform at the government level to just foster robust community engagement and more diverse and equitable community engagement in project planning and design. Directing federal funding to research and data that highlights existing inequalities. And to Noah's point, developing some purchase incentive programs for bikes and e-bikes. The fourth is promoting sustainability. So, identifying the roles that bikes can play in climate change mitigation, adaptation, creating policies that streamline bike projects and access to transit to meet sustainability goals, positioning bikes and e-bikes as tools for disaster recovery, which we've learned is a big gap at the onset of this pandemic that was clear. Battery recycling programs for electric bikes, and just advancing sustainability within bike making in general. And the fifth is growing the bike industry. So PeopleForBikes is equal parts a 501c6 bike industry trade association and a 501c3 foundation. And on the trade association side, we see it as our role to grow the bike industry. So proactively address trade and supply chain issues, decrease tax burdens on bike businesses. A lot of the progressive legislation that we help pass helps the bike industry. Protecting the industry from chemicals legislation, and just advancing workforce development practices. So that is a lot, but I find it extremely exciting, and it's been a wonderful opportunity for everyone at PeopleForBikes to put our heads together and think about how we meld our local, our state, our federal policy teams, our local innovation teams, our marketing teams, our ride spot teams, to just create a better environment for everyone to bike more often. So that's that. I think that's the end of our slides. I'd love to, and I speak for Noah too, we'd love to hear what questions you all have and just have a little bit of discussion about this right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan and Noah. Really exciting stuff coming up. So yeah, go ahead and start dropping your questions into the Q&A toolbar, and we'll answer those out loud as we go. And I'm going to go ahead and start with one of the questions that was dropped into the chat. So let me go back down here. So not seeing it anymore. Maybe Chad deleted it and put it somewhere else. Okay, we'll start with this one from Peter. What toolkits do you have for local retailers and communities to educate and advocate for these policies on a local level?
We do have a toolkit. I'm going to throw it in the chat here, and essentially it's, I'm pulling it up here just so I can speak to it, but it's how can someone, for example, a retailer with a business interest in the city, use that business voice to connect safe bike networks with their customers and the needs of their customers. There's really there's probably no better person to speak to the needs of bicycle riders than someone who actually sells them the bike. They're the ones who get the questions about, where can I ride this? Is it safe to ride? Where are some safe transportation networks? So we try to encourage retailers to use their voice and kind of their role in supporting safe and continued bike riding. And I'll add that in the chat here.
Great, awesome. Thank you, Morgan. And I found another question here in the chat from Michael. Thank you. So I participated in another call this week that indicated public transport is down considerably and many transit entities are struggling. Hopefully, the new federal administration will assist in promoting and funding for mass transit. Do you have any information or hunches in this regard? So funding for mass transit with the new administration.
So yeah, mass transit is facing a real crisis of funding right now, with ridership low across the country in major systems. I'm in DC, and WMATA, our local metro system, is probably going to have to cut weekend service, among other things. So it's a huge crisis in transit. And as people who ride bikes, we know that biking and transit go really well together at a city level and county level, urban and rural. So we want to be able to support transit funding where we can. It doesn't, if Congress is able to agree on negotiations for a COVID funding package before the end of the year, there's some funding included in there in the latest rounds that have been made public of a potential funding deal. There's some funding in there that's been set for transit, but it's certainly not enough compared to what these systems really need to keep running, keep people moving, and keep their staff working. So to the extent that we at People4Bikes have been able to support the broader call of transit advocates to Congress asking for emergency funding, we've signed letters, we've joined statements, things like that. But it's just an unfortunate, another consequence of this pandemic is this funding crisis that our transit systems face.
Great, thank you, Noah. And there was an anonymous question. What about using e-cargo bikes in public fleets? And Noah, you had answered that, but I wanted to give you the chance to expand if you'd like to.
Yeah, and Morgan, you should feel free to jump on this one too, but I think I didn't mention e-cargo in my e-bike incentive section, but that e-cargo bicycles are a huge part of this. And it's not just cities that we're hoping we know are thinking about expanding their vehicle fleets to include electric cargo bicycles, or maybe even replace some of their, go-karts or cars, just because of the amount that one can move on an electric cargo bicycle, and the wide variety that you can find of, cargo in the back, in the front, and the sides. There's UPS ones that have sort of I don't even know, a trailer that's like taller than the person on the back. So we are seeing some cities and counties at the municipal level exploring these. We're talking to e-cargo suppliers and figuring out ways we can support those partnerships. And, I would not sleep on companies like UPS, FedEx, Amazon that do massive amounts of deliveries in urban areas and could really benefit and are exploring electric cargo bicycles as a vehicle they can use for their workers.
And I'll add a little bit. In states and cities, there are some concerns around curbside management, and you can't, it's not always amenable or appealing to park your, cargo bike that you're using for last mile delivery or as a personal delivery device on the street. And so what are some of the policy and kind of city ordinance limitations on curbside parking, short-term curbside parking, things like that, and obviously the safe infrastructure piece. So we're doing what we can to work with Amazon and some of the other providers Noah mentioned to make sure that cities have either model ordinances or existing ordinances in place to make it easy to drop that bike for 10 minutes, go in and deliver something and come back. And that to me is a real pinch point right now.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. A question from Hugh. Is there any industry talk about diversifying inventory in retailers with a focus on bikes for transportation versus recreation? This would help in the policy field of climate change, congestion relief, air quality, etc. So transportation versus recreation.
Yeah, Hugh, that's a really good question. And I think I'm not sure what your background is. We've been trained to think of, your Saturday morning bike ride different from your bike outfitted with panniers and lights and cargo capacity. You know, suppliers, well, let me back up. I think that does us all a disservice. I think that the conversation around, is this bike for fun or for transportation, is no longer relevant, and most suppliers are diversifying so that, especially in the e-bike space, so that the bike you buy can serve multiple purposes and you can carry things on it pretty easily. So sure, I think suppliers and retailers are diversifying, just because with the onset of safer bike networks and infrastructure, that creates more demand to ride that, to get places, to get to the rec center, to the grocery store, to work, to school. And I would say the trends that we're seeing are generally that suppliers are diversifying to meet that need.
All right, awesome. A question from Jay. So on your last point about growing the industry, what is PFB doing to promote reshoring, and more importantly, working with the National Venture Capital Association to lobby for component manufacturers to enter the US and form clusters of component suppliers? So how are we, growing our onshore efforts in the US?
Yeah, in our in the trade agenda that Morgan shared in the chat, and I would recommend taking a look at. We do address in there the need for different types of incentives to start with the component manufacturing level. We know the story of the bicycle industry really being stuck without U.S. manufacturing, with affordable U.S. manufacturing options in the 90s. And the way to start building that back up and start onshoring in a meaningful way in the U.S. has to start with component manufacturing. So in our trade agenda, we have a policy plank in there that recommends different types of incentives for component manufacturing onshoring, because with tariffs, that's never going to happen. That just requires capital that's being taken away with additional duties. We haven't worked with the NVCA before, but it's something we're continuing to explore, and our network of trade partners in Washington, D.C. and industries that were, facing similar issues with the tariffs continues to grow. So I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. And thank you for the recommendation.
Thank you, Noah. We've got time for maybe two more. So from an anonymous attendee, thank you. So we've got a question on language for e-bikes. In the US, we call everything an e-bike. Do we need to help cities and consumers understand the differences in order to stay ahead of safety issues and regulations? We're already seeing an issue on the MTB trails with some people just riding electric motorcycles.
Yeah, we did try to get ahead of this when we developed with the industry the 3 classes of e-bikes. So, and those all fall within the EU definitions of speed pedelecs and pedelecs. The class 1 is a pedal assist e-bike with the maximum assisted speed of 20 miles an hour. A class 2 is a throttle actuated e-bike with a top assisted speed of 20 miles an hour. And a class 3 is a pedal assist with a top assisted speed of 28. And so what that does is it allows, so yes, we are doing education with cities and consumers, but what the classification system does is it allows, for your example of mountain bike trails, the ability for local agencies to further distinguish what type or class of electric bicycle is allowed on those trails. And most are opting to simply allow class 1 electric bicycles on trails. And so we found that it's generally been widely adopted and embraced because it adds that extra layer of control at the local level, but still is coordinated with the European Union electric bicycle definitions, the consumer product safety standards for manufacturing and for sale, and simply the types of products that are sold into the US. So I would say one of our biggest pinch points is making sure that retailers know how to describe those 3 classes when someone says, where can I ride this? Or someone has a question about what the different speed and wattage capabilities are of the various electric bicycles. But so far it's been a good conversation starter to educate consumers and retailers about what the different bikes are.
Okay, Thank you. And I think we've got time for one more really quick from Jeffrey. Thank you for your question. What type of support is PFB able to offer for local projects for bike building? Specifically, our company is developing youth riding in an urban area with existing bike paths.
Jeffrey, I would just encourage you to send me or Noah a note, and we are able to provide support. And a lot of times it's just thinking through ways to message projects, to secure funding, to build broader coalitions. Let's see, Morgan at PeopleForBikes.org or Noah at PeopleForBikes.org, and we can kind of take it from there. Honestly, the answer is it depends, but we're here to help and feel welcome to consider us a resource at any time.
Great, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Send any additional questions through. We're happy to answer those. And last minute here, there was a question on, do we have a way to educate our new riders to welcome them into our framework from Peter? Thank you. And I just dropped in 2 resources related to that. Our industry and rider campaign called Keep Riding that has been running for the last couple of months, as well as our Ride Spot app, which is a way for new riders to find routes, have a sense of community, get some tips on riding. So yes, we definitely have plans to welcome these new riders, shepherd them, and keep them riding. So yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and Morgan and Noah for speaking. This has been wonderful. I'm gonna jump to the next slide. If you have any additional questions, please send them here to Noah or Morgan, and we will get those answered directly. All right, thank you so much and have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thanks, bye-bye.